is I don't believe them anywhere near what you think we can, and I don't think we'll ever be able to isolate those perfect children. I mean, IVF was developed to help infertile people have children. In fact, it was developed for women who had blocked tubes. That's what we started off doing back in the 1970s. Since then, of course, it's expanded to other sorts of subfertility, like male factor, unexplained subfertility, and we do reasonably well with those couples. But even then, we try really hard. We try to improve the pregnancy rate all the time to do better with those couples. PGD spun off as sort of value added to IVF, where Alan Trouson had this idea that we could take some cells off the embryo and do certain tests. But let's be clear about what PGD does. It really, first of all, it's not a roadworthy on the embryo. We can't take a cell off the embryo and say it's a normal embryo, let alone it's a talented one, which people like us to do, you know, the blue eyes and the good athletic ability. We'll never be able to do that. That's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. And if we do go to PGD to look for something like cystic fibrosis or some other single gene disease, which we try to eliminate from two carriers, it's a difficult, complex process. It significantly increases both the cost and the complexity of IVF, and less than 5% of people going through IVF actually take part in PGD. And of course, the other thing about it is that even if you do make the diagnosis and you put that embryo back, there's no guarantee it's going to take. It's about a 1 in 3 chance. So I think the first thing we have to do is refocus what technology will be able to do now, or what it can do now, and what it might be able to achieve in the future. And I don't think we'll have the ability to choose the perfect children and use it for eugenics.
Does that, in your mind, then create a different ethical debate? Does it change the ethical questions that we have to grapple with? Or is it, once you boil it down to essential principles, really the same thing, just a matter of degree?
Look, it's really difficult. I guess the ethical debate is, well, we go back one step further in Victoria, because we've got an ethical debate about who may or may not be parents by IVF. You know, the only place in the world where you have to police record check before you can do IVF. You have to go through and be approved to make sure you don't have any history which is not approved of, that you haven't been unkind to children in the past. So we already do ethical screening of who may or may not be parents by IVF, not that we do it for natural parents. And then, of course, if we're going to do any other genetic screening in Victoria, we have to justify it to the to the patient review committee and people who decide whether it's a reasonable thing to screen for or not. So therefore, I think, what we're talking about is the pipe dream, because I'm never going to approve any of those things. We'll never be doing them, and I think we're talking about sort of fantasy land.
But I guess what I'm asking then is, does that mean the argument, for example, that Julian's putting, where people should be making these decisions to try to bring into the world a child that has the greatest advantages, does that argument lose its force because, for example, the knowledge on which it's based is not as solid as we might think?
Well, we don't have to think about IVF. We know that children born to people who've got certain things like they're overweight, who smoke, who have marijuana, have a disadvantage. And we know that mothers dying in pregnancy might affect children. We've got the Baker hypothesis about what happens to you at birth and in utero, and how the child's going to affect you. And do people in the community take any notice? No, they don't. They all smoke, they drink, they're overweight. And, people in the community do not make the best efforts to produce the best and healthiest children they can.
But if I'm overweight and I want to lose weight, that takes a lot of effort. Not the same as ticking a box on a form that says choose this child or that child. And so it's a different sort of circumstance.
But after you've ticked the form, you've got to go through the IVF process, which takes a lot of effort.
I mean, look, we may as well go home and there's no debate to be had, according to your argument, and, so be it. But I frankly find this... I know what you're saying now is focused on the present, and I know you have a business in IVF and reassuring people that everything's fine. But even if there's just one test or a series of tests, and you've got to remember that in 10 years' time you'll be able to analyse, presumably, the whole genome of an embryo. Now, you may not be able to pick somebody who's going to have a perfect life, but you'll get information about various characteristics besides the disease propensity. Now, I frankly can't believe you that you won't be able to test for eye colour. You could test for the ACE gene that enables you to be an elite mountain climber. I mean, there are genes that are already identified that dispose to certain characteristics in people. Now, I really can't believe that we won't be able to make any decisions that aren't just about disease in 10 years' time. But if we can't, debate's over. We might as well go home.
One of the things that we are debating right now is the question of gender, people choosing gender, which has got the capacity to do. It's, as I understand it, relatively easy and relatively confident that you can do it. That raises issues for us of what I've used the phrase reproductive discrimination. That is, decisions that are made on grounds that we think they shouldn't be made. And here I'm on the moral side of things. It's interesting I'm quite happy to talk about moral obligations. I know that Julian's uncomfortable about it, but I do think there are issues to be raised about decisions that people make that are discriminatory. And a decision to have a boy or a girl and to use the technology for that purpose does seem to me to raise concerns for the whole community, not just for that individual couple and their child.
You said that you're worried about people undertaking IVF for what you call frivolous reasons.
Well, I've not used that word. But,
well,
yeah.
do you therefore suggest that there are reasons that would be perfectly acceptable, or is that enough for you to say that the whole idea is unacceptable?
I understand the motivations of people who use IVF in order to have children. The desire to have a child is an enormous desire, and it's a way in which people fulfil their lives by being parents and so on. So I understand that motivation. What I'm talking about, I guess, is using that technology developed for that purpose for a discriminatory purpose, to decide what sort of children there should be, which is not what it was designed for. And it's a reason I think that the community needs to look at and decide whether the technology should be used for those reasons. And the community has looked at it, and the legislation here in this state and the national guidelines both prohibit using reproductive technology for the purposes of choosing gender. They do allow the technology to be used to choose against major disabilities, and that's the purpose of the Patient Review Committee, is to look at Patient Review Panel, to look at those issues. But there is an argument in the community about whether that's discriminatory, and I take the view that it is. I think it is reproductive discrimination to eliminate embryos because you think that they have disabilities, that is, they have characteristics that you would prefer they didn't have.
It's a really interesting example that you raised, Julian. I wouldn't mind coming back to you on it. Because of your opening remarks about choosing children that have advantages, for instance, over those that have disadvantages, does that change where advantage is socially constructed? Gender being a good example. Plenty of places in the world where it's highly advantageous to be male as opposed to being female. So does your ethical logic lead you to a conclusion that it's perfectly acceptable to selectively bring males into the world without necessarily thinking about what that might mean for society in the long run when there are no women left?
Well, another example is often given to me in the US, where there's discrimination against African Americans, whether you should prefer to have lighter skinned children rather than darker skinned children so they don't suffer so much disadvantage. So you have to, what's the best way of correcting injustice in society? Well, the best way is to deal with the attitudes and the institutions that cause that injustice. It isn't about interfering in reproduction. It isn't about engineering. Of course, you might think that it's a good way to make a statement, to have a certain kind of child, to try to promote respect for people of a disadvantaged or discriminated class. But I don't think that even in this case it's a reason to prevent people from making choices. If they make choices in those cases to have a white child or make a choice to have a male in a sexist society, that's the symptom of the disease. It's not the disease. The disease is the background set of institutions, attitudes and norms and so on that require changing, not whether we interfere in their reproduction or not.
Sure, but should we be facilitating the symptom, I guess?
Well, again, here you have to ask how far are you facilitating the disease itself by allowing people to make these choices? And I mean, if you look at India, why do people select to have a male in India? Well, one reason is that only males can have religious obligations to the dead and bring, the dead parent into some kind of heaven. You also have to pay an enormous dowry if you have a girl, so it's very expensive to have a girl, and part of it's an economic reason. That's why people choose to have, but partly it's a religious reason and partly it's an economic reason. That's why they have a strong pressure to have male babies rather than female babies. Now, I think those are sort of crazy institutions, and we should change those. But given that they're there, I don't see why we should interfere in people's choices.
Let's shift it back away from cultures that favour one gender over another, and just look at gender discrimination in reproduction in our society, where we don't have those obvious, at least I don't think we do have those obvious differences, although I guess you could say that we do still to some extent, that men still earn more than women on average and those sorts of things, so there is some discrimination left. But generally you wouldn't say that there was a huge advantage either way in being male or female. But it's still an issue when a couple chooses to use this technology and on that occasion makes a discriminatory choice to say, right now we would prefer to have a girl rather than a boy. And it's offered in terms of family balancing. The idea of if we've got two boys already that we want a girl, or vice versa, rather than continuing to have children trying to get that girl or get that boy, we could do it by go on the IVF program and have PGD. It still seems to me that there's an issue for the community there. Beyond in India and China, we know the balancing has worked out very badly, and we know in some provinces of China there are 138 boys born to every girl born and that sort of thing. But we wouldn't expect that here. So it's not that the economic argument that you're putting or the balance, those sorts of arguments. It's really this individual choice. And I still think that there is a problem with a couple intervening in such a way as to destroy those embryos that have the unchosen gender and favouring those of the other and transferring those, using the technology in that way. That does say something that I think is unfortunate.
Would you also disagree with sperm sorting?
Can I finish what I'm saying? The issue here is that you're making parenthood conditional. You're making the entry of a child into life conditional upon whether the child belongs to the gender that the parents want or not. And the view I take is that there shouldn't be any conditions on whether a child is to be born or not. There shouldn't be a kind of sifting out of which children may be allowed to survive and which not. That all children, the whole nature of parenthood, if you think about what happens in parenthood, all of the things that can go wrong, all of the things that turn a perfect infant into a difficult 2-year-old and an even more difficult adolescent, all of those sorts of problems that can develop, parenthood needs to be an accepting sort of thing from the beginning. We need to be able to say that as parents we will accept our children no matter what, and that's been the character of parenthood. That there is a unilateral gift that you make as a parent to accept that child and rear that child and care for that child no matter what. But the whole process of putting them through a technology to choose a child greatly undermines what it means to be a parent and what parental love actually means. Well, it's no longer unconditional.
Where is the evidence for that claim?
I might jump here to Gab Kovacs, because I think you've got a lot to say on this issue.
Well, I have. I mean, first of all, I guess I'm in the difficult situation. I've seen several couples who want to come along for gender selection. I don't believe I've seen anyone who's come along saying we're going to have our first child and want that first child to be a boy or girl. So in our community, the problem is basically family balancing. And I was going to ask Nicholas how would he feel. I understand he doesn't like the embryos being discarded. But if it's said to couples, OK, you can come along, you can have IVF and PGD, you only want a female child, that's fine, but are you prepared to donate all the other male embryos to some other couples who'd be happy to use them, who can't get pregnant, so those embryos aren't wasted? Would that remove one of your oppositions to gender selection, Nicholas?
Well, my objection is to having all those embryos in the laboratory in the first place, and putting them into that situation where their life is just subject to choice in that way.
But, I mean, that's one way you could look at it. But gender selection is here and it's very real. But again, let's get our feet back on the ground, because I think, obviously, I'm debating with philosophers who talk about ideas. I'm a simple gynaecologist who has problems to solve every day and has to be fairly non-judgmental, because often I sit in my consulting room and I'll see a woman who wants a termination, and I'll see somebody else who's got a fertility problem, someone else who wants to be sterilised. So it's really difficult not to be judgmental, but I have to try and divorce myself and look at the problem of that particular couple. So when the couples come along, and to do PGD, you've got to be dedicated, because rather than getting pregnant at home, You have to go through a whole gamut of IVF, all the things that are involved. The people who are now doing it are going off